Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from, welcome. We're so glad to have you all here for this conversation. My name is Diana Duarte. I am the Policy and Strategic Engagement Director for MADRE, and I'll be moderating this conversation today. As you're joining, as you're getting settled in, please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're zooming in from, and maybe share one reason that you're excited to join this conversation. A quick announcement that this event features Spanish translation, so you can use the controls at the bottom of your Zoom screen to turn that function on. And once again, I'd like to welcome you to this event that we're calling Indigenous Women Lead, Charting a Just Recovery from the Pandemic. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our panelists who will be presenting today. And thank you also to Representative Deb Haaland for joining us. Again, my name is Diana Duarte. I'm with MADRE. MADRE is an international women's human rights organization that partners with community-based groups worldwide to confront war and disaster. We have a fantastic panel of speakers here today, women leaders, policymakers, and organizers who will be addressing an important set of topics, namely, the need that we have to spotlight the ways that this pandemic has disproportionately impacted Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women, the need to support the solutions that Indigenous women are advancing to protect their communities, and the need to seize this moment to create transformative change, to reimagine our societies in ways that protect human and planetary health. And Indigenous women's leadership is essential to that. You should have received a link to a sheet with bios of all the panelists for more information. But just to do a quick roundup, we have Representative Deb Haaland from New Mexico. We have Yaso Bhattachan, Vice Chair of the National Indigenous Women Forum in Nepal. We have Janine Yazzie, Co-founder and CEO of Sixth World Solutions. We have Martha Ntoipo, Founder and Executive Director of Pastoralist Information Development Organization in Tanzania. And we have Ifat Susskind, the Executive Director of MADRE. And I'll be asking each of them to speak in a moment, but just a quick announcement that please, as we're going along, please add in any questions that you may have for the panelists into the Q&A box also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'll be holding on to these for the Q&A session at the end. And one more quick note before we get started. We have partners joining from all over the world, and unfortunately, internet is not always so reliable. I discovered that myself a few moments ago. And as connections may be unstable, we may have to turn off their video and play a video recording of their remarks, which we've also prepared. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ifat Susskind, Executive Director of MADRE, to share a little bit more about the current context we're in and why this conversation is so important right now. Thank you, Ifat.
Thanks, Diana, and good morning or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. We're really, really happy that you've joined us today. And we invited everyone to this briefing because we know that you are as concerned as we are about the interlocking crises that we're facing right now. The global pandemic, the economic collapse that it has triggered, the surge in authoritarianism and racism that we're seeing in this country and around the world, and all of this unfolding against the backdrop of the ongoing climate crisis. All of us are asking how we craft policies that are robust enough to meet the enormity of these challenges. And in trying to answer that question, we are not looking to those who created these crises for leadership. We are looking to those who offer us a different logic, one that can put us on the path to a just recovery from the pandemic and a just transition to more sustainable and equitable economies and societies. And at MADRE, we really look to our partners for leadership. We are really, really grateful to have them with us today, and particularly grateful to Representative Deb Haaland for joining us, for sharing her time. And you know, the Congresswoman, I think, recognizes something that everyone in government needs to understand, which is that women who are organizing at the most local level are some of the best policy advisors they could have. Because so often it's the case that the people who are closest to problems are also closest to solutions. That's what we believe at MADRE. And for those of you who don't know us, we, as Diana mentioned, MADRE is an international women's human rights organization, and we partner with women who are really on the front lines of war and environmental disaster around the world. We do grant making and we do human rights and legal advocacy so that women who are meeting very urgent needs in their communities can also be creating long-term solutions to the crises that they're facing. And I think we understand the very grave needs in Indigenous peoples communities right now, the disproportionate impact that the pandemic is having on their territories and for their people, the worsening hunger and poverty that people are experiencing, and the many ongoing forms of colonization, including extractive industries that are so destructive on so many territories, and very outrageous and terrible rates of violence against women and girls, to name a few. We also know that long before this pandemic struck, Indigenous women have been at the heart of forging solutions to these problems, that they have been putting forward a worldview about how we can live in harmony with one another and with nature, that they have been forging community-based collective approaches to self-governance and to natural resource management, demanding food sovereignty so that their communities can be healthy and make decisions about where their food comes from, and standing up against extractive industries, of course, that are causing climate change. These are the building blocks for a just recovery. These are the building blocks for the kinds of policies that everybody needs to be able to have more resilient communities and societies, and to be able to emerge from the crises that we're in now on a stronger foundation. So I'm very, very grateful to be able to learn from our Indigenous partners, to be able to uplift your work, and want to thank you for taking time from that really, really important work to share some of what you know with all of us. So, and thank you also to everybody who's tuning in and listening online for being part of the conversation. Thanks, Diana.
Thanks, Sifat, for that introduction. We're very honored to have Representative Deb Haaland join us today. As you may know, she is a 35th generation New Mexican who's an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Laguna and also has Jemez Pueblo heritage. After running for New Mexico Lieutenant Governor in 2014, Representative Haaland became the first Native American woman to be elected to lead a state party. And during her time as state party chair, she traveled to Standing Rock to stand side by side with the community to protect tribal sovereignty. She is the co-chair of the Native American Caucus and was elected as one of the first Native American women to serve in Congress. And since joining Congress, she's been a staunch advocate of Indigenous communities' rights and leadership in the US and globally. During the pandemic, Representative Haaland has advocated to ensure that Native American communities and tribal governments receive adequate relief, health services, and public safety resources. And thank you very much, Representative Haaland, for joining us and for sharing your remarks.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful being with all of you today. Thanks for the invitation, and what a wonderful way to spend my morning with powerful women. I'm so happy and honored to share a few words during this important conversation. For those of you who don't know me, I am Deb Haaland, representative for New Mexico's 1st Congressional District and one of the first Native women serving in Congress, as Diana mentioned. I'm a single mom, a 35th generation New Mexican, and enrolled at the Pueblo of Laguna, although my grandfather, he was from Jemez Pueblo. He is of Pecos Pueblo descent. The Pecos Pueblo essentially was decimated by the mid-1800s, and the Pecos people ended up moving in with the Jemez Pueblo people because they shared a language. So I'm a proud descendant of Pecos Pueblo. As a Pueblo woman, I was raised to feel connected to the earth and to carry on the legacy of countless generations who came before me, who valued the responsibility to pass our national treasures on to future generations. I learned from my parents and grandparents to respect nature, and I have worked to protect our open spaces, our air, and our water. As a candidate, I made the issue of climate change and climate justice central to my campaign because I believe it's the greatest challenge of our time. When I entered Congress, I vowed to make sure that Native voices, especially the voices of Indigenous women, would finally be heard, and that I would bring to light the issues that had been ignored for far too long. I was appointed as the Vice Chair of the House Committee on Natural Resources and secured a seat on the subcommittee for Indigenous People. I'm also the co-chair of the Congressional Native American Caucus with Representative Tom Cole, who's been a tireless advocate in Indian country. I'm also the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands. Together, we guide bipartisan caucus work. It's through these leadership positions that I educate my colleagues about the issues that affect Indigenous people in the US and abroad, and allow me to bring Indigenous voices to the table. I've always said that I can't speak for my tribe or any tribe, but I can absolutely do my best to make sure that tribal voices are heard in the halls of Congress. The COVID-19 pandemic magnified the inequities that exist in our country. For example, my state of New Mexico, Native Americans make up almost 11% of the population, but comprise only almost 50% of the positive coronavirus cases in our state. Across the United States, Native Americans and Black folks have a hospitalization rate for COVID-19 5 times that of white people, and Hispanics are hospitalized at a rate that is 4 times more. Why is that? Tribes start way behind the start line. A legacy of environmental racism and injustice has left far more susceptible to COVID-19 and with fewer healthcare options. The disproportionate rates of COVID-19 infections that you see in Indian country are a result of the poor quality of Indian healthcare, lack of resources that goes back for decades. Many tribal communities lack access to basic resources that help combat this virus, like water, electricity, and broadband internet service. If people don't have access to the internet and healthcare information, how can they find ways to protect themselves or ask questions? How can people access telehealth resources if they don't have broadband? How can kids finish their schooling in a time like this and have opportunities for success if they can't connect to the outside world? These inequities, along with some very public examples of racial bias in our police system, have brought the issues of racial justice to the forefront of American discourse. We must address these problems in our recovery efforts. The Green New Deal, a proposal for a big, bold transformation of the American economy to tackle the twin crises of inequality and climate change, can serve as a model for just recovery. Drawing on this vision, the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis unveiled a climate action framework last week that includes several of my policy proposals. My Climate Stewardship Act supports reforestation on tribal lands and in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color, as well as traditional farming techniques. My 30 by 30 resolution to save nature, to conserve at least 30% of the land and ocean in the US by 2030. And I'm working with international partners and Indigenous advocates on the 30 by 30 movement globally. Improving infrastructure for tribes is also essential. The House of Representatives just passed the Moving Forward Act, including my amendment to help tribes access broadband spectrum to promote connectivity. Senator Elizabeth Warren and I have also been working with the US Commission on Civil Rights to update their original Broken Promises report studying the federal funding shortfalls in Indian country. The updated report will include new information regarding how the pandemic and lack of funding has further disenfranchised Native Americans. Before the end of this month, Senator Warren and I will also be introducing our new bill called the Honoring Promises to Native Nations Act as the congressional response to the Commission's broken promises. This legislation will increase funding for Native nations across the board for healthcare, education, housing, economic development, and public safety. I'm proud of the work that I'm doing in Congress and the steps all of us have taken to ensure that Indigenous voices are heard. But I know that we're still at the tip of the iceberg. As the infection rates continue to increase during this difficult time, I'll continue working toward equitable solutions to our recovery from the pandemic and continue to appreciate all of the work that my colleagues in Congress are working to move forward and make better. Again, I thank you so much for giving me this opportunity and look forward to more of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Representative Holland, for your comments and also for your leadership on these crucial issues. With that, I will turn to our next panelist, Yaso Kanti Batachan, Vice Chair of the National Indigenous Women's Forum in Nepal, an umbrella organization that works with Indigenous women to advocate for the elimination of social, political, cultural, religious, and linguistic discrimination. Yaso has dedicated her career to bring visibility and legal recognition to the rights of Indigenous women and girls in Nepal. And again, more information is available in the bios document that you received. And while Yaso is live with us here on the Zoom call, unfortunately, we have been navigating some issues with internet connectivity. And anticipating that challenge, we asked Yaso to record her comments in advance, which she very graciously did. Thank you so much, Yaso. And so I'll now turn to my colleague Akila to ask her to play that video. And Yaso will be staying with us here on the call through to the Q&A section at the end for any questions that you may have for her. So Akila, could you please play the video?
Of COVID-19 in Nepal, the Indigenous Sisters, Honorable Congresswoman Dev Holland and fellow speaker. Horche, greetings on behalf of Indigenous Sisters from a mountain country, Nepal. I am honored to speak in this historic virtual event, Indigenous Women Lead, charting a just recovery from the pandemic and share our experience during this difficult time and our solution for a path forward. I am a member of Thakali Indigenous Nation from Thasang in the Trans-Himalaya region of Nepal. I had never thought that one day I would be sharing a situation with a member of the US House of Representatives. Thank you, Madre, for making it possible. In my country, Nepal, COVID-19 pandemic has made vulnerable groups such as Indigenous peoples, Dalit, Madhesi, Muslim, and women more vulnerable. We Indigenous people comprise 38.2% of the current total 30 million population of Nepal. Our Prime Minister says no one will die due to hunger, but millions of Indigenous peoples are fighting hunger every day as we have been uprooted from our ancestral land due to the policy and laws of the state. Today is the 108th day of the lockdown in Nepal. Violation of human rights, repressive measures, racism, development aggression, and violence against women are rising. Though few people have died since the start of COVID-19 in Nepal, the number of infected persons are rising every day. Public health experts are of the view that the number of infected could be 10 times more than the official figure. Yet, disaggregated data about the impact of Indigenous peoples and women is not available. In brief, both in Nepal and around the world, Indigenous peoples and other vulnerable groups are very hungry and angry. So we need both immediate and long-term help and support from all, including the US government, to use this moment of crisis to create a new and better normal. It means we need at least some important international human rights-based responses to the pandemic. One key need is making sure that the US provide adequate aid to the Nepal government to respond to the pandemic, and these funds should be distributed to communities through grassroots organizations led by indigenous peoples and indigenous women in Nepal. These groups knows best what the needs are in the community and how to reach the most marginalized. And the second most important need is that US government should support international rights standards which provide a framework to ensure a recovery that protects all peoples. As pandemic has triggered rise in gender-based violence, the United States support in implementing CEDAW in Nepal to address it would be timely. We welcome the US support to indigenous women of Nepal for the meaningful implementation of CEDAW recommendation of 14 November 2018 to the State Party, Nepal, to amend the constitution to explicitly recognize the rights of indigenous women, in particular this right to self-determination, in line with the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Further, the US could provide support to Nepal in providing free accessible treatment and information in indigenous language for COVID-19 to indigenous peoples as a human right obligation, and to ensure access to food, clean water, sanitation and education for indigenous communities. While doing so, states should respect and support indigenous peoples' customary self-government's decision to keep their community safe by respecting their broader closure. To address the pandemic and climate change, we must protect indigenous sovereignty and land rights. This includes establishing a mechanism to obtain free prior informed consent of indigenous peoples in large-scale development projects, including hydropower, conservation area, and road construction by government and private companies in line with UNDRIP, is a must for our survival in a post-pandemic situation. During the pandemic and in the long term, government need to stop development projects like these harm indigenous rights. At minimum, this should ensure free prior informed consent is respected. They must ensure that these principles are codified into laws. We need a right-based response, putting indigenous peoples and indigenous women at the center by ensuring proper consultation and engagement with us in policy making. We also need an intersectional perspective, engaging indigenous women, persons with disability, LGBTI, etc. The US and Nepal government must fully implement the UNDRIP without qualification. To conclude, the way we will recover from COVID-19 and build a better society is by putting indigenous peoples at the center. Indigenous women have shown the way for the survival of and respect to the Mother Earth and or all living and non-living beings. If we follow the lead, we can come up of this crisis more resilient, sustainable, and more just. Let our spirit and ancestor bless all of us. Thank you, Orche.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yaso. You touched on a lot of really important points, and one in particular that struck me is the importance of the international human rights framework, and especially how Indigenous women have strategized in advocacy spaces to demand and secure protections for their communities. And plus, you know, just this week, as we're learning about the victory and halting operations of the Dakota Access Pipeline, we know that Indigenous peoples worldwide are still confronting mega development projects like the one that Yasso mentioned, even now in a time of pandemic. So thank you, Yasso, for pointing out these potential spaces of learning and of strategic exchange. Next up, we'll turn to Martha Ntoipo of the Pastoralist Information Development Organization in Tanzania. Again, Martha founded PIDO as a women's organization that works at the community level to help pastoralist Maasai communities to adapt to climate change, promote education for Indigenous girls, and promote programs for food security and HIV/AIDS care. Today, Martha provides workshops and leads campaigns with other Indigenous women and girls to collectively advocate for their rights and promote climate justice. And Martha, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Diana. As Diana introduced me, my name is Martha Ntoipo from Tanzania, and I work with Pastoralist Information and Development Organization, working with women and girls, adolescent girls. And because of the time, I will just go straight to my contribution to this webinar. And I'll start by saying that it is really vital for that Indigenous women are leading in policy governance and in policy and governance spaces. And this is because everyone benefits when Indigenous women shape the policy discourse. Because Indigenous women bring values of intersectionality that centers those who are made most vulnerable in decision making. And the pandemic, this pandemic is a crisis, but it's also a learning point. We should ensure that no one is left behind, because it has shown us that there are gaps that need to be filled. And I'll give an example of an intervention we had to do with partnering with MADRE. We provided food baskets to widows, and we would have done with the elderly as well, because the need was great and the resources are never enough. But we have, through that help from MADRE, we have been able to help the women, those women who have had their children hungry. And so Indigenous women and people with disability, Indigenous girls, are experiencing different impacts when it comes to this pandemic. There's an increase in female genital mutilation. There's an increase in teenage pregnancies, because people we are faced with something that was not there, and we have to come together to make sure that this does not repeat itself. We need to ensure that everyone has equal opportunities. Indigenous women also bring a worldview of balance with our planet and the natural lands and natural resources. And these are the things that sustain us. And because I'm a pastoralist, I'm a Maasai, we are pastoralists, and we depend on nature for pasture, for water. So we must address climate change and put in place adaptation and mitigation strategies. Women are also struggling. They are already struggling, but with climate change, the work is doubled, actually tripled. They have to go longer distances to get water, to get firewood. So the workload is already too much, but it is doubled, it's tripled already. So Indigenous women also bring alternate community-based solution that we can build on in transitioning to a more just society. Grassroots groups like PIDO and other grassroots organizations, we are deeply rooted in communities, and we can have access to those who are outside the reach. We have access to those who are in the community level and those who are at the international level. So we apply culturally sensitive approaches, and because of the trust we have with the communities, we are even more effective in reaching Indigenous communities with information and awareness. So governments can learn from the community-based examples to advance effective solutions to the pandemic and beyond. Governments can partner with grassroots and fund grassroots organizations in order to promote health and giving adolescent girls a voice and decisions. And we need to give sanitation supplies to remote and rural communities who have no access to such without external help. So what are the preconditions to ensure Indigenous women can participate and lead effectively in policy and governance spaces? The first one is economic justice and empowerment. So the pandemic has had devastating impacts on communities, but it's more on women because of not being independent economically. And women are not in the policy spaces because of not being economically empowered as well, because they would have a seat at the table and they would have aired their views. And so economic justice will be vital to making sure that they are not left behind. Economic justice is the only place that is the only tool that will make women reach there. And we need also to address the issues of domestic violence. We need to ensure that women are living a life free of violence and making policy spaces available to all. It should be accessible through the languages, physical accessibility, and every accessibility that we can think of. And when it comes, there is a great need for funding. And I would urge the donor governments, the multilateral agencies, the philanthropists, to make a condition that this, like the grants or the money they provide should have a condition that unless these people are involved, then the funding cannot be accessed. So that the projects that are designed, the projects that are funded by that money will take a participatory approach and have in place, and take the issues of the Indigenous women in place. And I'm grateful to be here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Martha. I want to express appreciation for your focus not only on the solutions that Indigenous women advance, but also on the need to focus on the conditions for and obstacles to Indigenous women's leadership. Next up, we have Janine Yazzie, co-founder and CEO of Sixth World Solutions. She is the Sustainable Development Program Coordinator for International Indian Treaty Council and serves as co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development, which is engaged with the UN High-Level Political Forum on the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. She's also co-founder of Sixth World Solutions LLP and the Navajo Nation Little Colorado River Watershed Chapters Association. Janine, welcome, and please go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and pleasure to be here alongside such powerful panelists on this extremely important topic. You know, with my work, both with having to adjust to support relief work on the ground here on the Navajo Nation and in the Southwest United States, and still having that perspective and that level of engagement at the national and international level around COVID responses in general, but in particular looking at the unique impacts of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations, and Indigenous women and children, it becomes very clear that the solutions that we need are irreconcilable under systems that are rooted in colonization and heteronormative patriarchy and white supremacy. And until we can name these things and the way that they show up, both in the problems as they present themselves, but also in the proposed solutions that do not have that critical analysis, we will continue to be caught in the cycle of oppression, and a cycle that needs to be broken in order to ensure that we do not return to a normal or to a status quo that continues to profit off of the exploitation and the disappearance and the murder of Indigenous women, children, men, and two-spirit peoples. I've been so frustrated about the conversations around recovery, because I see these beautiful graphs. I see this important data that has been collected in the midst of this pandemic. And still, even when there's a focus on marginalized people, our marginalized subgroups, the Indigenous and Native American data on our communities is always missing. How is it that in 2020, we are still living in a time where it is okay and it is not questioned, even by other marginalized groups, that we have an erasure and outright invisibility of this nation's original inhabitants? This is at the root of the injustice, and this is why the legacy of colonization and how it shows up in these institutions needs to be named and shown. For Indigenous women here in the Southwest, we've had this horrible experience in the midst of this pandemic at one of the most notable women's hospitals in the country and in our state, Loveless Women's Hospital, where Indigenous women who went in to give birth were discriminated based upon their looks and their zip code and separated from their children until they underwent a COVID test. Like, that wasn't applied to anyone else, but it's instances like that that speak to the legacy and the prevalence of discriminatory practices against Indigenous women and children that needs to stop. You know, with what Congresswoman Holland is putting forward, that's why her solutions and her legislative movements are so important to highlighting and bringing the voices, the data, and the solutions that are necessary to address these issues. We don't have time anymore. Our people are dying disproportionately from this disproportionate impact of COVID on our communities. And it's not just, the numbers don't really capture the true impact that these deaths are having. It's not just an individual here and an individual there. It's entire households. It's entire families. And it's going to have an impact long after we find a way to get a hold of the spread of this virus in our communities, long after we develop a vaccine. The experience and the trauma and the layers of loss are going to be felt by our communities for many more years. And so to take this time and the recovery measures that are being promoted to address the root issues and the root inequalities, to bring in the critical community infrastructure that our communities need, the broadband, the water, the energy, and to reimagine how we invest in and build that infrastructure so that there is local control, there is local ownership, there is decentralization, so that there's equitable access across the board for all marginalized peoples, is going to be fundamental for building a foundation for a truly just recovery effort. And I know that as Indigenous women, we will always be on the front lines of that fight, from everywhere, from protecting our treaty territories, to protecting our vital natural resources, to protecting and advocating for our children and their right to a free, true, just education. We have always held these front lines. And now more than ever, it's important to use these international frameworks, because there's been wonderful advancements, especially with the work that I've done with International Indian Treaty Council. They have been at the forefront of pushing a lot of the development of these international frameworks on behalf of Indigenous peoples. But those international frameworks don't have teeth unless we make it have teeth, unless we fight for its implementation in our local policies and in our national policies. And we can do so with our representatives like Congresswoman Deb Haaland and other representatives that are truly there to help represent and bring remedies to these centuries of injustice. And, like the work to honor the promises of the Native Nations Act, the Climate Stewardship Act, and the Moving Forward Act are just 3 examples of things that we need to stand behind, educate ourselves on, and lobby for. But also, regardless of what Congress does, still fight to implement in our communities, because we cannot wait for someone else to develop the solutions or finally wake up and realize how important it is to pit resources where it matters. We have to fight for that every day in our efforts, are as we see from the COVID impacts. Our communities are going to continue to die disproportionately from the legacy of the violence. And you know, that with what we're seeing in our communities, all of the pre-existing conditions, all of the pre-existing inequalities that have led to our unique vulnerabilities to this pandemic have only worsened in the midst of this pandemic. We're seeing an increase of violence against Indigenous women and children. And when we already had an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. We're seeing an increased lack of access to clean drinking water, to housing, to employment, because Indigenous women, being the sole providers of most of their households, were often employed in service sectors, are in frontline occupations, and either lost their jobs or lost their lives. And now the entire households are without that sole source of income. This is an epidemic of grand proportions that needs to allow us to wake up our allies and our partners who should be standing beside us in this fight and demanding for us to be included in all of the documentation of the impacts of this language through disaggregated data. Because only when we have the real numbers of how Indigenous peoples are impacted both in rural areas, on our reservations, and in urban centers, where the majority, like a large majority of our populations reside, will we be able to truly develop the solutions that are necessary and ensure that the most marginalized are not left behind. And that is how we ensure the foundations of a truly just world in our recovery efforts. And so I'll wrap it up there, but it's just an honor to be here alongside so many fantastic panelists. So thank you, Madre, for your great work.
Thank you very much, Janine, for that. Appreciate, especially the call for real action, for, not just protections on paper, but how do we actually enforce positive legislation? How do we enforce those international human rights standards at the local level where people's lives can actually be saved? And with that, I want to open it up for a bit more of a conversation, for a Q&A. There's some questions that have been coming in through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Encourage other folks to please send in any others that you may have. But one of the first questions that we have, and I'll kick it off with this one, is that all of the commentary that the panelists have shared shows that we are facing a broad, immediate global crisis in this pandemic, and a much broader reality that we have to work to change of systemic oppression, right? And so, we're thinking about choosing actions and prioritizing actions in the here and now. Where do you all see that support is needed most immediately? And what efforts should people who have human rights in mind, who want to value human rights, what would be most effective for people to be doing right now? And I'll throw it out to, to the panel for anyone who would like to address this question.
I wanted to give someone else a chance to answer that, but I'll go ahead and jump in and start the conversation. I think right now more than ever, our collective power could be used to mobilize, to pressure our state governments and our national government, our federal government, to recognize the human right to water. That is the basic necessity for life. It is the basic need in order to stem the spread of this virus. Our people need access to clean drinking water and the ability to abide by the social distancing requirements and the hygiene requirements that will keep their households safe. And right now, it should be ludicrous for any citizen of this country and any other citizen of the so-called developing world that is subject to U.S. imperialism, that this country, this so-called developed country, greatest country in the world, does not recognize the human right to water. And I think that now, you know, a lot of that facade is being cracked and being shown, and we're seeing more exposure of the systemic inequalities that exist within the United States. But to focus on solutions, that's where our collective power needs to be focused for the benefit of all, which is fighting for this human right to water, to be recognized and to be respected, effectively respected at every level of service to the people who live in this country.
I would absolutely agree with that. And that's one of the reasons why climate change is such an important issue that we all need to address. There can't be any more denying of climate change in this world, anywhere. We have enough water for people to drink. We just need to make it a priority. And so, yes, the indigenous communities around the country, the Navajo Nation is absolutely one, where people, either they don't have running water or the water is polluted from years and years of mining and unreclaimed mines and other extractive industry pollution that people there face. So we need to pay particular attention to our environment right now, cleaning up our messes, giving people clean air and clean water to drink. You know, New Mexico is home to the largest methane cloud hovering above our state, the northwest corner of our state. And I'm not a doctor or a medical expert, but I have to believe that if children and people are breathing polluted air, that when a respiratory virus comes through, that they will have more of a susceptibility to that virus. So there is so much that we need to do. Part of the problems, and it's something I'm working on, and when I mentioned the 30 by 30 resolution, we absolutely feel that the 30 by 30 resolution will help with this issue. Right now, public lands emit 25% of carbon emissions into our atmosphere. And 25% is a huge number. Our public lands are lands that every single person should be able to enjoy. But we are selling them off at rock bottom prices to extractive industries so that they can further pollute our country. And a lot of those lands are particularly tied to indigenous people. Native Americans weren't at the table when the exterior boundaries to our reservations, pueblos, and nations were drawn. And we don't cease having an obligation to protect our sacred sites just because they're not within our exterior boundaries. So we have a lot of work to do. I feel that you know, climate change and our environment are the most important things right now, because people need to access clean water, clean air to get past this terrible pandemic.
And I also want to make the connection between what you both were just saying with, you know, something that Yasso raised earlier in her comments around the impact of development projects that are proceeding, you know, road development and so on, that are proceeding even amidst a pandemic and that are displacing indigenous peoples there. I wonder if Yasso, you have any comments about that experience or potential strategies or solutions that you all are working on in your context.
Okay, thank you, Diana. During pandemic and before pandemic, indigenous peoples in their pandemic also, there is a question of right to food, right to live, right to livelihood, and right to life. The question is there. And indigenous people are dying because they work daily wage labor and they cannot go to work because of lockdown. And we have 10 endangered indigenous people in Nepal. Still, some are nomadic. And the social protection money, each of them used to get 3,000 rupees a month. And because they get that social protection, and government stop the relief distribution to them. And because they were so poor, when they go in the market for to get food, they were not allowed because they cannot pay, they don't have money. So they were bound to go to the forest and look for roots and tuber and all those vegetable fruit in the forest. And because of the national forest, community forest, again there are some policy, and because of climate change they cannot get the forest product what they should be getting. So because there is a lot of hand to mouth problem in Nepal, and because of migrant worker from because we are close to India, and from foreign countries like Qatar and all those Arab countries, our indigenous brothers, sisters, they go for work. And when they came also, there was not facilities to come back from that country. And if they were also, they were not, the quarantine center were not well equipped. And they were, and again, almost 800,000 people from Kathmandu valley migrated in the village, internal migration in the village. And that way they walked thousands, 500, 600 kilometers on the way. Pregnant women, old women, children, they died on the way. So there is a lot. And again, during this pandemic, person with disability, they were not able to get their health care facilities and all those diapers and all those medical equipment. So that way also the person with disability, men and women, they were facing. And also the rape cases and suicidal cases are more than almost more than 1,500 cases of suicide has happened. And so it is really, and again, we don't have a disaggregated data of the impact of COVID during this period. And also during this period, as Diana has said, that I have raised in my presentation also, during this period also road expansion, there was protest going on, and police were having the people in Kathmandu Valley, the valley called Kokana, there also they have a lot of violence against indigenous peoples. The indigenous peoples of Newar, the traditional ancestral homeland of Newar is Kathmandu Valley, Lalitpur, Bhaktapur, Kritipur. And recently, 3 days ago, some of our sisters, they were bruised and they were hurt by the police. So during this pandemic situation also, we are facing this type of problem in Nepal. So also there is a lack of information in mother tongue. In Nepal, we have 125 language speaking people. So most of the people, they don't understand the awareness raising program, all those by the government that is disseminated in official language, Khas Nepali. So in most of some of our organization, they have been translated in indigenous language where majority indigenous peoples live. So we have been trying internally by ourselves also, and the indigenous television in Nepal, they have broadcast in almost 10, 14 indigenous people's language. So that has made easier. Again, indigenous peoples, they don't have access to Wi-Fi or all this science and technology. They cannot afford to have all those. So during this time of pandemic, our children are having online classes, and on online classes also they cannot afford to have their smartphone, mobile phone. So there are also some suicide case with the young children also. So there is a lot more to say, you know.
Yes, thank you very much, Yasa. Yeah, and you touched on actually, as I'm looking in the chat, there's a few questions that have come up here that you touched on, right? Which is about how do we ensure the participation and leadership of Indigenous women with disabilities? That's one important question that I could put to the group as well. And then there was a question around recognizing the role that militarization has played in this moment, where Indigenous peoples have been, how their organizing has been confronted for time immemorial, but now, especially in the moment of pandemic, the challenge is all the more acute. So, you know, those are two questions to put out there as well. And I'll put one last question, since we are running short on time. Just a general question about, you know, if there are any other, you know, how has transnational solidarity and exchange impacted your work, and what are some of the best practices and strategies that you've been able to enable in your work to take advantage of transnational solidarity? Maybe Martha, if you'd like to you know, address that question briefly, and then we can open it up to others as well.
Thank you. It has done a lot, because actually we get a space to express the challenges we face that we thought that we were the only ones facing. And once you are in transnational space with people from different indigenous communities across the globe, you find out that that is a common problem amongst the indigenous people globally. And it has strengthened us that we share the problems and we share the solutions. We exchange, we give different views, we give different ways in which we approach the problems locally, and that can be used when we work back at our community level. And I found out that having this, it's an opportunity to be able to get connected. For example, I can give an example of MADRE's last Wednesday's webinar that we had, and talking about domestic violence in the time of COVID-19. It made me realize that domestic violence, especially in my community, has always been there, and I may have viewed domestic violence in a different lens and thinking that this is the only thing that is domestic violence. But I ended up asking myself, what is not domestic violence? You know, and why are we? I found out that we have been focusing on other things that are equally important, but we may have overlooked the issues that have persistently been there and are affecting people in ways that we cannot even tell, because it touches this emotions, it's psychological, verbal, you know. So getting a chance to work with different people opens up the brain and opens up ways in which you can address the problems that we face locally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martha. Ifat, was there something you wanted to add as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to say in relation to a few of the questions that I think, especially for those of us who are based in the United States, that there is a really important opportunity to understand the pandemic, but also the economic crisis and climate change, not just as domestic issues, but to really see the global dimensions of all of those. And I think that that has been, for many of us, one of the really stark lessons of the pandemic. And you know, the way in which all of us are interdependent, and not just with people, but also with the ecosystems that we rely on. And those messages that Indigenous women have been putting forward for a long time that are so applicable to the climate crisis really serve us, I think, as we're thinking about just recovery from the pandemic. And so, you know, Janine mentioned 3, you know, examples of concrete pieces of legislation that are in the United States right now that are ours to support. And I think it's really important for us to be asking our representatives and one another, you know, what are the global implications of what the United States might be doing at this time? Because it is going to be really, really important to make sure that we are doing the opposite of this America First ideology, and to really be thinking about America as interdependent with the rest of the world. And we can do that concretely through policy. We can do it very concretely through budgeting. And so to get very material as we're thinking about solutions in terms of resources is also going to be important.
If I could just say one thing, I have been have developed a relationship with the first Indigenous woman in the Brazilian Congress, Joenia Wapichana. And we've written an op-ed together. She came over here with 3 other women in the Brazilian Congress. We were able to host her at the Capitol. And I just feel like, regardless of where you are in the world, Indigenous women have a certain, they start off together in having so many values that are the same. And so I think it is absolutely imperative that Indigenous women can embrace one another during this crisis, but also anytime, because I think we have a unique perspective, and we're able to move so many issues forward. So I just wanted to mention that. And right now, of course, we met before the pandemic hit, and now, of course, Brazil is right behind the United States with a number of positive cases. And that is affecting Indigenous cultures there. And it's not surprising to see that the president in Brazil has been extremely violent toward the Indigenous people and tribes living in the Amazon. So we have a lot of work to do, and I just think it is beneficial to all of us to know what each other's struggles are, so that we can be a voice for that change.
Thank you very much. Oh, Janine, did you want to add something?
Yes, just really quickly. When I said that it's vital to recognize that the roots of a lot of our issues and systemic inequalities are due to a heteropatriarchy that is rooted in white supremacy, I also wanted to make it clear that violence has always been a tool of the apparatus in order to make sure conformity or allegiance to that system of power. And so the militarization question is why we've seen it so prevalent throughout time, and why we're seeing it being galvanized as some sort of tool to deal with this public health crisis, and to continue to promote that perception of power, like with what happened at Mount Rushmore last week, to continue to promote a backwards agenda and violations even of these health recommendations in order to celebrate that symbolism behind that power. It is why all of these things are tied together. And that has very much an impact on the invisibility of women with disabilities and across a lot of movements. Ableism is a part of that conditioning. It's a part of valuing people for what they're able to produce in a capitalist society. And when they're not able to produce, then they're not valued. And so it's incumbent upon us to always be conscious of these ways that we're conditioned under the system of oppression, and deconstruct those ways, those biases, those assumptions, and ensure that the voices of our sisters living with disabilities, our trans, our LGBTQIA relatives are being included, so that we don't speak for them, but we create pathways for them to speak for themselves and solutions that make sense for their communities. And towards this end, with the transnational solidarity, one of the things that has been enormously beneficial for the work that I do internationally with International Indian Treaty Council and with the Indigenous Peoples Major Group is that we see these connections despite these geopolitical boundaries, despite these different issues around nationalism and how national identity is developed and used to inform solutions, are to frame the problem as something out there, and to unite around rights-based approaches and rights-based solutions that are necessary to address the systems change that is needed for all of us to deal with climate change, to deal with the legacy of colonization and the legacy of injustices that's created in our communities. And so I invite you to learn more. You can join our mailing list for Indigenous Peoples Major Group, where we champion a rights-based approach framework, both in renewable energy development, but also in landscape scale development around conservation. Before COVID hit, we were set to testify before the Senate Committee on Natural Resources to find ways to support how to incorporate these safeguards in the way money is invested from the US in conservation projects in so-called developing countries. And so there's a lot of opportunity to continue to build off of that transnational solidarity that we need in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. We're just a few minutes past the hour, and I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I know this is such a rich conversation. We could definitely go on for much longer. I believe also that the Congresswoman had to leave, and she expressed her thanks for being part of this, and we definitely express our appreciation for her, so we'll pass that along to her as well. But just, is there anything else that folks would like to say in closing, perhaps Yasso or Martha? Yasso, please go ahead.
We Indigenous Sisters of Nepal are looking forward to closer partnership between the US Congress and Indigenous sisters around the world. And on behalf of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous sisters from Nepal, we like to thank Honorable Congresswoman Dev Holland and MADRE team for organizing such a wonderful this webinar for all of us, all the sisters around the world who are listening. So, because she, Congresswoman, spare her time to listen our problem, our issues, and our pain. We all sisters were telling all our problems, and she was listening, and I hope it will work for the better society and also the just world we Indigenous peoples want to live. And also the emancipation from all those inequality, injustice, and all those exploitation, discrimination, racism, which is going on in this world. So it is making our life more harder. And with this discussion, and maybe in future, we will be able to collectively in action and with solidarity and networking, we could work together to make a better world for the Indigenous peoples and Indigenous sisters and all the humanity in this world. And thank you again, once again, Madre, for this wonderful opportunity given to us from a developing and underdeveloped country like Nepal, and in Nepal also Indigenous peoples like us. So thank you so much from bottom of our heart, on behalf of all the Indigenous peoples and sisters. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasso. Martha, please go ahead.
Thank you. I would also like to say that in order to ensure that we have equal opportunities, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, in order to be able to be on the same platform, we need education for our children. We need safety for those children to ensure that they remain in schools. The challenges that they face, for example, in my community, the challenges of female genital mutilation, the challenges of not even being able to get sanitary pads, and the challenges that climate change has added to the women. Climate change impacts everyone, but the women feel the pinch. So diversifying livelihoods is a key to actually mitigate to the impacts of climate change. And having this space with a representative from the US Congress is an amazing opportunity, something that I have not ever thought I could get a chance to. So on behalf of myself and the Indigenous women of Africa and the world, even though we are represented, thank you, Madre. And thank you for the great work you do. And I pray that the Congress and any other bodies that make policies will take into considerations our views, the things we aired, so that those developed countries can help the developing countries. And most specifically, those who are marginalized even within the developing countries. So Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you, Madre, and thank you for everyone who has joined us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martha. And with that, I want to close by thanking all of you speakers. Thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you to all of the people who are joining in the chat and who sent in questions and who are participating in this event. We will be following up with you via email with more information, including a recording of this discussion and information in writing about the discussion that we've had, the recommendations that have emerged, and any other follow-ups from the panelists as well. So thank you very, very much. And we wish you all of the best. Please stay safe, everyone. Thank you.